June 14th, 2000. Jonesboro, Arkansas. 20-year-old Amanda Tusing leaves her fiance's apartment to drive home to her parents' house, but never arrives. Her abandoned car is soon discovered by the side of the highway, but Amanda is nowhere to be found. Days later, Amanda's body is found in a waterlogged ditch over 12 miles away, but there are no signs of sexual assault and the exact cause of death cannot be determined. One theory is that Amanda may have been pulled over and abducted by someone impersonating a police officer, but the identity of her killer and the motive for this crime remain unknown. After that, the trail went cold.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today I'll be covering two unsolved cold cases from Arkansas: the 2000 murder of Amanda Tusing and the 1989 murder of Dana Stidham. That voice you just heard narrate our intro was Jamie Wynn, the winner of the most recent Trail Went Cold listener voiceover contest, and she did an awesome job, so thank you very much, Jamie. As you probably know, this is a recurring monthly contest which has been going on for a year now, and next month, I'm going to be doing something special by picking not one, but 5 separate winners to do guest narration on our special Halloween episode. So if you haven't already entered our contest, I will be providing instructions about how to do so at the end of this episode. We also currently have a poll going on right now in which you can vote on which case we will feature on the Halloween special, but you'll hear more details at the end. Anyways, you can probably tell by her accent, Jamie hails from Arkansas, so the case she requested I cover on the podcast when she originally entered this contest was the murder of Amanda Tusing. But since there's only a limited amount of information about that case, I decided to combine her story on this episode with the murder of Dana Stidham, which also took place in Arkansas. There are some similarities in these cases, as both victims were young women who went missing after their abandoned cars were found by the side of the highway before their bodies were eventually discovered at a different location. Some have speculated about whether these two cases might be connected, though one of them does have a fairly promising suspect, while the other seems like a real head-scratcher. Regardless, I will be examining both of them on this episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music. And not only that, but we are finally on Spotify now as well. So of course, if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is also on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now start off by exploring the unsolved murder of Amanda Tusing. Our first story begins in Arkansas in 2000. Our first victim is 20-year-old Amanda Renee Tusing, who goes by the name Mandy, and lives with her parents, Ed and Susan Tusing, in the small town of Dell. Mandy is known for her love of animals, as she has a job in a veterinarian's office and is hoping to become a vet herself. For the past 3 months, Mandy has been engaged to her fiancé, Matt Irvin, who lives in Jonesboro. On the evening of June 14th, the couple went out for dinner together before they returned to Matt's apartment. At around 11:30 p.m., Mandy was preparing to leave and return home to her parents' house. It was a very stormy night with heavy rainfall, and since it was a 40-mile drive from Jonesboro to Dell, Matt asked Mandy if she would spend the night. However, since Mandy had a 1 a.m. curfew and had a class scheduled at community college the following day, she insisted on going home, but promised to phone Matt to let him know when she arrived safely. So Mandy left and drove away in her 1992 Pontiac Grand Am, but by 1:30 a.m., Matt had not heard from her, so he decided to call her house. Susan Tusing answered the phone and told Matt that Mandy never arrived, so Ed Tusing and Mandy's twin brother Andy both agreed to go searching for her, while Matt did the same. They headed in opposite directions on Arkansas Highway 18 until Matt eventually discovered Mandy's Grand Am by the side of the road at around 3 a.m. It was parked underneath a streetlight, and even though the car was locked, the keys were in the ignition, and the wipers had been paused while in mid-swipe across the windshield. However, there was no sign of Mandy herself. Matt eventually met up with Ed and Andy, and they went to the nearby town of Monette to call the police and report Mandy missing. When police checked Mandy's car, they found nothing wrong which would have prevented her from driving it. Mandy's wallet and cell phone had been left behind in the front seat, though the phone's battery was dead, and there was also a can of Coke in the cup holder, which was about 1/2 to 3/4 the way full and still chilled. An extensive search was performed of the area for Mandy, and it would soon end in tragedy. On June 18th, her body would be discovered in a waterway known as Big Bay Ditch, located off Highway 135. Even though she had been traveling east at the time she went missing, this location was over 12 miles west from where her car was found. Mandy's body was fully clothed, there were no signs of sexual assault, and the only injury appeared to be a small bruise on the back of her head. It was initially assumed that the cause of death was drowning, but since there was water in Mandy's nasal passages, but none in her lungs, it seemed likely that she was already dead before she was placed in the ditch. While the medical examiner believed that Mandy had been suffocated, her body was so waterlogged that it could not be conclusively determined how she died. Unfortunately, due to the heavy rains which had taken place, any evidence that might have been left behind by the killer was washed away. The whole tragedy had a major impact on the community. At the time, Mandy's hometown had a population of just over 250 people, but more people attended Mandy's funeral at Dell Baptist Church than lived in the town itself. Since Matt Irvin was the last known person to see Mandy alive, he was thoroughly investigated by police, and after passing 3 polygraph tests, he was ruled out as a suspect. One of the only establishments on Highway 18 before the spot Mandy's car was discovered was a quick shop convenience store, but a check of their surveillance footage turned up no trace of Mandy or her vehicle. Investigators did not have a lot to go on, so Susan Tusing eventually approached a psychic profiler named Carla Barron to help with this case. She failed to generate any substantial leads, but Mandy's story was profiled on a 2006 episode of Haunted Evidence, a TV show in which psychics work with law enforcement to help solve cold cases. In 2007, police announced they had a promising lead, as a witness had come forward who claimed they overheard people talking about Mandy's murder, but it sounds like this lead never went anywhere. One of the primary theories which has been pushed forward about this case is that Mandy may have been pulled over by a police officer or someone impersonating a police officer. Her mother has stated, quote, "We always told Mandy that if she ever got stopped at night to go where there were lights, and her car was found surrounded by homes, and it was underneath a streetlight." End quote. Since there were no visible signs of struggle in Mandy's vehicle, the perpetrator could have taken Mandy by surprise, either luring her into their own vehicle or abducting her by force before they subsequently murdered Mandy and dumped her body in the ditch over 12 miles away. Apparently, police did get calls from people who claimed they'd seen another vehicle blinking their lights at them in an attempt to get them to stop on the same night Mandy went missing. But because these witnesses didn't actually stop, they were unable to provide descriptions of the vehicle or the driver. The theory about the killer impersonating a police officer was not without precedent in Arkansas. Just a few years earlier, the state was terrorized by a serial criminal known as the Blue Light Rapist, who mounted a blue light on his car and used it to trick multiple female motorists into believing he was a police officer and pulling over. He then used this opportunity to abduct and rape his victims. In September of 1997, the Blue Light Rapist was identified as a suspect named Robert Todd Birmingham, who was subsequently convicted of rape, kidnapping, and aggravated robbery, and received an 80-year prison sentence. Investigators actually explored this theory in regards to Mandy's case by interviewing all known law enforcement officials in the area and giving them polygraphs, but none of them emerged as suspects. It's also been theorized that due to the lack of evidence found at the crime scene, the perpetrator may have been a serial killer and Mandy was not his first victim. At one point, the local authorities asked for assistance from the FBI, who provided them with a profile of the perpetrator. They concluded that he was likely a white male in his 50s who lived in the area near where Mandy's body was found. At the moment, the investigation into Mandy's murder has reached a standstill, and no one has emerged as a promising suspect, but there is some speculation that her death might be connected to another unsolved murder of a young woman, which took place in Arkansas over a decade earlier. In the summer of 1989, 18-year-old Dana Stidham had recently graduated high school and moved into an apartment in the town of Centerton with her brother and some friends. She was thinking about enrolling at the University of Arkansas and possibly moving back home with her parents in order to save money for school. Dana's parents lived just over 10 minutes away in Hiwassee, and on July 25th, she stopped by there to do some laundry. At the time, Dana's father was feeling ill, so he asked if she would pick up some Alka-Seltzer. Dana left in her 1984 Dodge Omni and made the 10-minute drive to the nearby town of Bella Vista in order to purchase the Alka-Seltzer and some other items from the Phillips food store. Dana would chat with numerous people there who recalled seeing her drive away, and a time-stamped receipt would confirm that she made her purchases and left shortly after 3:17 p.m. However, Dana never returned home, so her parents went looking for her, but after failing to find her, she was reported missing later that evening. Dana also had a date scheduled that night, but never showed up for it either. At around 6:30 a.m. the following morning, Benton County Sheriff's Deputy Karen Myers was driving to work when she saw a gray Dodge Omni parked by the side of Highway 71. Myers also noticed that a battered pickup truck with an attached camper was parked behind it, with the passenger side door open, and a man was kneeling behind the Omni. It was only after she arrived at work and learned about Dana's disappearance that Myers returned to the scene and ran the Omni's license numbers to discover it was Dana's vehicle. Of course, by this point, the pickup truck was long gone. Anyway, there was no sign of Dana, but the keys were still in the ignition of her car, and the driver's side window was halfway down. The items she had purchased from the grocery store were in the back seat, but her purse was missing. The left rear tire was a bit flat, though not bad enough that the vehicle couldn't be driven. It also turned out the driver's seat had been adjusted for a person who was taller than Dana, which seemed to indicate that someone else had been driving the car before it was abandoned. What struck everyone as odd was the fact that this particular stretch of Highway 71 had been checked several times after Dana was reported missing, mostly between 9 p.m. and midnight the previous evening, but the Omni was not there at that time. So this seemed to indicate that the vehicle was not left there until the early morning hours of July 26th. Karen Myers was put under hypnosis in order to see if she could remember more details about the pickup she had seen. She described it as being a 3-tone Chevrolet Ranchero with a medium green top and a dark wood grain insert in its middle. The lower part of the truck was white, and the license plates were black and white. The laundry which Dana had been doing at her parents' house was not in her car, but 3 days later, it was found scattered along Wellington Road, approximately 1,700 feet from where her car was abandoned. On August 5th, a local resident contacted police to inform them that their dog had returned home from its run with a denim purse in its mouth. The purse turned out to be Dana's, and its contents, including her driver's license and checkbook, would be found in some weeds next to a roadside about a mile northeast from the spot her car was parked. It seemed likely that someone had tossed the purse from a moving vehicle. On September 16th, a squirrel hunter came across some skeletal remains in a rocky wooded area in Benton County. The location was near the Arkansas-Missouri state line, about 5 miles from where Dana's car was discovered, and was often used by local residents as a trash dump. The remains had been buried in a shallow grave in a dry creek bed and were likely unearthed by heavy rains which had taken place in the area. Believe it or not, this person who found the remains waited until the following day to contact the authorities because he didn't want them to interfere with his squirrel hunting. According to the local sheriff, quote, he said if he called Sunday morning before he went hunting, it would mess up the woods, which I think is a very bad attitude, end quote. When the remains were recovered, dental records eventually identified her as Dana Stidham. A search of the area turned up a t-shirt with duct tape on it, along with Dana's jewelry. The rest of the clothing Dana was wearing on the day she went missing was found buried nearby, and it would turn out that a strap on her bra had been slashed. Dana's skeletal remains had been scattered by animals, and while 90% of them were recovered, one piece which could not be found was her sternum. As a result, they were unable to determine her exact cause of death, but there was a nick on Dana's left shoulder blade to suggest she might have been stabbed. But unlike Amanda Tusing's case, this one had a promising suspect, a high school classmate of Dana's named Michael Earl McMillan. Michael had a romantic interest in Dana and repeatedly asked her out, but she rejected his advances and wanted nothing to do with him. And the days prior to Dana's disappearance, her friends recalled her acting differently and giving off the impression that she was afraid of something. What's interesting is that instead of traveling to the Phillips food store in Bella Vista, Dana could have saved some time by purchasing her items from a convenience store close to her parents' home in Hiwassee. The problem was that this store was owned by Michael's parents, and since he often hung around there, Dana wanted to avoid the possibility of crossing paths with him. On the night Dana went missing, witnesses had recalled seeing Michael riding around in his father's 1989 Ford pickup truck at around 3 a.m., and when questioned, he confirmed this was true. However, there were some issues with Michael's alibi. He initially told police that a girlfriend of his would be able to provide him with an alibi, but she denied knowing his whereabouts that night. Michael then changed his story and claimed that he spent the evening with a second girlfriend, but while she initially supported his story, further questioning by police finally compelled her to admit that she was not with Michael that night and could not account for his whereabouts. The week after Dana went missing, Michael also surprised everyone by making the sudden decision to join the Navy, even though he had spent the past several months actively avoiding Navy recruiters in the area. When Michael went on leave and returned home, he wound up getting arrested for stealing a temporary grave marker from Dana's headstone and would be convicted of misdemeanor theft. Michael's justification was that since he had missed Dana's funeral after enrolling in the Navy, he wanted something to remember her by, and since it was only a temporary grave marker, which would soon be thrown away, he didn't think anyone would miss it. A former girlfriend of Michael's also claimed that he would visit Dana's grave at midnight and start crying. In 1996, the Ford pickup truck which Michael had been seen driving on the night of Dana's disappearance and had since been sold to another person was tracked down and sent to a lab in Fort Worth, Texas for forensic testing. Hair samples would be found which closely matched Dana's, but since they did not have their follicles at the end, they could not be conclusively matched to her. Michael would be re-interviewed, and investigators took note of the fact that he still carried around a photograph of Dana in his wallet after all these years, but even though he had since gotten married, he did not carry around a photo of his own wife. Michael wound up failing a polygraph test, and also provided this bizarre statement: "Sometimes I think I did kill Dana, but I know I didn't." Thanks to a court order, investigators were able to obtain hair samples from Michael over the objections of his attorney, but in the end, there just wasn't enough evidence to file charges against him. The biggest issue is that no one could place Dana and Michael together on the day she went missing, as there were no confirmed sightings of Dana after she drove away from the food store that afternoon. In 2013, investigators announced they were looking into a possible connection between Dana's murder and a 62-year-old suspect named Orville Mitchell Goodwin, who had been charged with the attempted murder of his girlfriend. Goodwin had shot the victim in the face and left her for dead in a creek bed in Bella Vista, similar to the location where Dana's remains were found, but no tangible connection could be found between the two cases. Sadly, Dana's father and brother have both since passed away without ever finding out who killed her. So at the moment, the murders of Dana Stidham and Amanda Tusing continue to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Well, when you look up discussions about these two cases online, you'll often see them linked together, and on the surface, it might be tempting to think they're connected. Both of them involved young women from Arkansas who went missing after their abandoned vehicle was discovered by the side of a highway with the keys still in the ignition, and their bodies were eventually found at another location miles away. However, the cases really aren't as similar as they appear. Aside from the fact that they took place over a decade apart and over 300 miles away from each other, the exact circumstances of how the victim's vehicle wound up by the side of the highway appear to be different. It seems likely that Mandy was abducted directly from her vehicle after she pulled over, but in Dana's case, the evidence strongly suggests that she was murdered elsewhere, and her vehicle was left by the highway by whoever killed her. So in spite of these similarities, I am inclined to think these cases are not connected at all, and that both women were murdered by different perpetrators. However, both these individual stories are worth examining, so I'm going to start off with Amanda's case. This one is definitely a real head-scratcher, because unlike Dana's murder, it's hard to discern what the motive might have been for this crime. Here's what we do know. Mandy left her fiancé's apartment to drive home to her parents' place, but for reasons unknown, it seems like she wound up pulling over on the shoulder of Highway 18, where she was either abducted or willingly climbed into a vehicle driven by someone who later killed her. Her body was then found in a waterlogged ditch over 12 miles away, and the evidence suggests that Mandy was already dead before she was dumped there. In most cases where young women are abducted and murdered by a random predator, committing a sex crime is the primary motive, but Mandy was found fully clothed, and there were no signs of sexual assault. Her wallet was left behind in her car, so this certainly wasn't a robbery. So unless Mandy was the victim of a stranger who just wanted to perform a random thrill kill, I have no idea why she was targeted, particularly since it doesn't sound like she had any known enemies. In situations like this, it would be so tempting to suspect the last person to see her alive, especially since he was her fiancé. According to Matt Irvin, Mandy left his apartment to drive home, but we technically only have his word about that, so for all we know, he could have killed Mandy himself and planted her vehicle by the side of the highway. He then calls up Mandy's parents and pretends to act worried before going out and quote-unquote discovering the vehicle himself. However, Matt was investigated thoroughly by police and ruled out as a suspect, so it seems like a certainty that he wasn't involved. Interestingly enough, even though Matt claimed that he went out to dinner with Mandy earlier that night, another witness had told police she had seen Mandy at another location taking line dancing lessons. Yet when they checked into both stories, Matt's was the one which completely held up. One of Mandy's teachers saw her having dinner with Matt that night, and the signature book for the line dancing class did not contain Mandy or Matt's names, so it's apparent this other witness was mistaken. So I think you can definitely rule out Matt as being the killer, but the problem is that there doesn't seem to be any other strong suspects. And then there's the question of how Mandy's vehicle wound up by the side of the road to begin with. There didn't seem to be anything wrong with her car, so what reason would she have had to pull over? Well, this is why one of the most prominent theories is that Mandy was pulled over by someone impersonating a police officer. Now, I already discussed how this method was used by Robert Todd Birmingham, aka the Blue Light Rapist, during the preceding years, but of course he was already in prison by the time Mandy was murdered. But since his case garnered a lot of media coverage in Arkansas, it's easy to see how someone else might have taken this idea and become a copycat. However, the big issue is that Mandy was not actually raped, and the Blue Light Rapist never murdered his victims, so if someone else was copying him in order to abduct and kill Mandy, what was their motive? Of course, an alternate explanation is that the perpetrator who pulled Mandy over wasn't someone impersonating a police officer, but an actual police officer. I know investigators explored this possibility by investigating a number of local law enforcement officers, and they didn't find any potential suspects, but you will find a couple of threads about this case in the topics forums, which are filled with rumors and innuendo, and one of them is that a former police officer from the area, who has since died of cancer, is the killer. Of course, since the topic forums pretty much exist to provide rumors and innuendo about cold cases, you should never ever take them as gospel, so I have no idea if there's any truth to these allegations. But whoever the killer was, it's still unknown whether Mandy was a random victim or if she was specifically targeted. There's been some discussion about the coke which was found in Mandy's car. Since it was over half full and still chilled, one theory is that she stopped somewhere to buy it on her drive home, and the killer saw Mandy at that location and then decided to follow her and pull her over. But from what I've read, there were very few places to stop and buy soda on Mandy's route from Jonesboro to Dell, Aside from a quick shop convenience store where police checked the surveillance footage and saw no sign of Mandy. It's possible that Mandy simply took the coke from Matt's apartment before she left, so it doesn't have any significance, but that's never been made clear. In any event, if Mandy wasn't pulled over by anyone, I guess the other logical explanation is that she might have decided to pull over herself because there was a bad rainstorm that night, which probably hampered her visibility, so she decided to stop and wait until the weather improved. Remember, Mandy's parents told her that if she ever stopped at night, she should do so in a well-lit area, and her car was found parked underneath a streetlight. So if Mandy simply decided to pull over to wait out the storm, the wrong person could have happened to come along, seen her there, and decided to take advantage of the situation by abducting her. Whatever the circumstances, I think it was likely a random stranger abduction, because how would anyone have known that Mandy would be driving on that particular stretch of road at that particular time of night? However, since there were reports from other witnesses about a vehicle which appeared to be blinking their lights at them on the road that night, I am still leaning towards the theory that Mandy was pulled over by someone whom she, at the very least, believed was a police officer. The fact that her keys were still in the ignition and the windshield wipers were in mid-swipe suggests that Mandy was abducted by force, but since there were no signs of struggle, the abduction probably happened very quickly. If the perpetrator was someone Mandy felt comfortable with, such as a police officer, then that would explain how she was taken by surprise. But until the investigation can uncover a promising suspect, we'll probably never know what the motive for this crime was. So if you happen to have any information on the unsolved murder of Amanda Tusing, please contact the Craighead County Sheriff's Department at 870-933-4551. That's 870-933-4551. So now let's move on to analyzing Dana Stidham's case. Now, unlike with Mandy's case, Dana's murder has a prime suspect, Michael Earl McMillan. Let me list off all the things which make him look suspicious. He repeatedly made advances towards Dana and asked her out, but she always rejected him. Dana was willing to inconvenience herself and go out of her way to an entirely different store to avoid running into him. He decided to join the Navy the week after she went missing, even though he'd always dodged the recruiters. He stole a temporary grave marker from Dana's headstone. He kept changing his story about his whereabouts on the night she went missing, and provided 2 different alibis which both fell apart, and hair samples were found in his father's truck, which were consistent with Dana's. I wouldn't say this is enough evidence to convict someone in a court of law, but on the surface, it does seem pretty damning. And yet there's a complication which always makes me double back, and that's the sighting by Karen Myers of the pickup truck parked behind Dana's car on the side of the highway the morning after she went missing. As you recall, a man was kneeling behind the car, though it doesn't look like Myers got a good look at him. I know McMillan was seen driving his father's pickup truck at around 3 a.m. that morning, but here's where the complication comes in. Under hypnosis, Myers described the truck as a Chevrolet Ranchero, but the truck McMillan drove was a 1989 Ford pickup. Unless McMillan somehow had access to a Ranchero at that time, or Myers was mistaken about what type of truck she saw, then that was likely an entirely different man kneeling behind Dana's car. The only other information I've uncovered about this Ranchero is from the April 28, 1992 edition of the National Examiner. I don't know any of the specifics, but apparently, the lead investigator on Dana's case was able to track this truck back to a Texas man who had sold it to a former Navy buddy living in Florida in 1987. Florida authorities then reported that the truck's black and white Texas plates were turned in at a license branch there. Unfortunately, I've been unable to find any follow-up to this lead, so I have no idea if the Ranchero was ever found. But to be clear, it was the Ford pickup truck which was given a forensic examination in 1996. Regardless, in spite of this discrepancy with the trucks, investigators are still pretty convinced that McMillan was the perpetrator, but they just lack the evidence to make an arrest. Now, like I mentioned earlier, it does not seem like Dana was abducted from her vehicle by the side of Highway 71. That particular stretch of highway was thoroughly searched on the evening Dana went missing, and no one reported seeing her car parked there until Karen Myers drove past it at 6:30 a.m. the following morning. So it's likely that Dana's killer drove her car to that location and left it there sometime during the early morning hours, especially since the positioning of the driver's seat seemed to indicate that the last person to drive it was someone much taller than Dana. The most frustrating thing is that there is no record of Dana's movements at all after she drove away from the food store in Bella Vista at around 3:30 p.m. the previous day. She was running an errand for her father, so you'd assume she was just planning to head straight home, and the drive only should have taken 10 minutes or so. She encountered her killer at some point after leaving the store, but there are no eyewitness sightings of her at all during this time period. It's already been established that Dana made a deliberate choice to make the longer drive to Bella Vista instead of frequenting the much closer convenience store in Hiwassee, since it was owned by Michael Earl McMillan's parents, and there was a chance she could bump into him there. So if Michael was the killer, I'd be curious to know how Dana wound up crossing paths with him, given that she went out of her way to avoid him. If Dana was abducted, she would have had to stop her car and pull over at some point during her 10-minute drive from Bella Vista to Hiwassee, but it's unclear how this came about. What we do know is that we have a window of about 15 hours between when Dana left the store and her Dodge Omni was first seen on Highway 71. The car was definitely not parked there the entire time. Given that police were searching that highway as late as midnight, that's at least 8 or 9 hours when the vehicle's whereabouts are unaccounted for. Now, Dana's remains were eventually uncovered in a shallow grave in a wooded area about 5 miles from where her car was discovered. It sounds like this spot was a great distance from the nearest road, and it probably would have been difficult to carry a dead body there. But since duct tape was found on Dana's shirt, I'd say there's a good chance the killer bound her and forced her to walk to this remote location. Since Dana's clothes were buried at a separate spot from her remains, she was probably sexually assaulted, and while the state of her skeletal remains made it hard to conclusively determine her exact cause of death, it does seem like she was stabbed. The crime certainly does fit the profile of someone like Michael Earl McMillan, who had an unhealthy obsession with Dana, both before and after her death, and did not seem to take her rejection too well. If Michael and Dana did cross paths that day, he may not have initially planned on killing her, but things escalated out of control. This might help explain Michael's odd line when he was being questioned. "Sometimes I think I did kill Dana, but I know I didn't." He may be using some twisted logic to justify his actions by convincing himself that if Dana hadn't rejected him, he wouldn't have been forced to kill her. But before we pronounce Michael guilty, we have to explain away the sighting of the ranchero. If the driver of that truck was the killer, then that would mean Michael is completely innocent, and Dana was killed by some unknown predator who has yet to show up on the radar. After all, even though investigators believe Michael did it, that hasn't stopped them from looking at other potential suspects, such as Orville Mitchell Goodwin after he attempted to murder his girlfriend in 2013. However, if Michael is the killer, then there are two possible explanations to account for the discrepancy with the trucks. A, he had an accomplice who helped him drop off Dana's car, or B, the man in the ranchero was a completely innocent bystander who noticed the car parked there while driving by and decided to pull over for a closer look. The reason I don't rule out the accomplice theory is that it's unclear how the person who planted the car at that location would have left the scene. Obviously, they couldn't have driven their own vehicle there if they were driving Dana's car, and if they decided to walk back to town along the highway, there's a risk of them being seen by motorists. But if one person drives Dana's car to the scene and has another person follow them in their own vehicle, then they can use that vehicle to drive away. Of course, no one else besides McMillan has ever been implicated in this crime, so if he had an accomplice, I have no idea who that person might be. However, I do think the most logical explanation is that the ranchero is nothing more than a red herring, and it belonged to an innocent motorist who pulled over to check on Dana's abandoned car and had nothing to do with her murder. Think about it. If this man was seen there alone with his own truck, then how did he plant Dana's car there to begin with? Karen Meyer saw him kneeling down behind the car, but remember, her left rear tire was a bit flat. If this guy was an innocent bystander, he may have seen the tire and assumed that the driver had either been picked up or found another ride into town for help. Now, you might be asking why he wouldn't have called the police or come forward once it made the news that this Dodge Omni belonged to a missing girl, but remember, this was the pre-internet world of 1989, so he may not have put two and two together. If the man was just passing through the area and didn't live there, It's possible he never even learned about Dana's murder. After all, it turned out the ranchero used to be owned by a man in Texas who subsequently sold it to a friend in Florida, so whoever owned the truck in 1989 may not have been an Arkansas resident. Since I've seen very little follow-up on the leads involving the ranchero, it's possible it's already been ruled out as being connected to this crime. But the point is, without the sighting of this truck, everything else points to Michael Earl McMillan being the perpetrator. While there's no physical evidence to implicate him, he has a motive, a history of suspicious behavior, and he provided not one, but 2 alibis which fell apart. If McMillan is the guy, there are still a lot of unanswered questions, such as how he crossed paths with Dana that afternoon, and the whereabouts of her car during the 15-hour period it was unaccounted for, but the most logical explanation is that he did it. All investigators really need is some hard evidence to implicate him, which will be difficult to uncover after 3 decades, but hey, we've seen cold cases older than this one get solved this year, so I won't lose hope. So if you happen to have any information about the unsolved murder of Dana Stidham, please contact the Benton County Sheriff's Office at 479-271-1008. Or you can also contact the Bella Vista Police Department at 479-855-3771. Anyway, another special thanks to Jamie Wynn for doing such a great job at narrating our opening. Since October 31st falls on a Wednesday this year, we've got a special Halloween-themed episode of The Trail Went Cold planned. Much like the 100th episode we released earlier this year, I thought the best way to mark the occasion would be to involve more of our listeners. Like I mentioned in the intro, I will not only be drawing one listener to narrate passages of our Halloween episode, I will be drawing 5. The draw will be taking place this coming Monday, October the 1st, on Facebook Live. Of course, if you've already entered this contest before, you are automatically eligible for my next random drawing, so you don't have to do anything. But if you want to enter the contest and haven't already done so, all you have to do is send me an email under the subject line, Trail Went Cold Contest, naming the one unsolved cold case you would most like to see covered on this podcast. So once again, send an email under the subject line, Trail Went Cold Contest, to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. And also, if you go to our Facebook page, we currently have a poll pinned to the top in which you can vote on which case for us to feature on our Halloween episode, and the poll closes this coming Sunday, September the 30th at midnight. So feel free to visit our page and cast your vote. Anyway, another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you have a moment, please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We've released some exclusive bonus episodes this month for our donors in tiers 2 and 3. This month, we did an episode about the Michael Scott Martin final appeal case from Unsolved Mysteries, and in October, we've got a special Halloween-themed bonus episode planned. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to take a moment to give a shout out to our newest listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon, and they are Justin S. and Anya K. Thank you so much for your support. And if you're looking for another podcast episode about the Dana Stidham case, I'd recommend you check out the Already Gone podcast by my friend Nina Instead, who did her own episode about it a couple years ago. Just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who is responsible for our eerie music score, and yes, our Halloween-themed version of the Trail Went Cold theme will be reappearing on all our October episodes next month. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and even Spotify. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday as we begin the month of October by releasing a Halloween-themed episode of The Trail Went Cold.